And this morning, Psalm 90, a prayer of Moses, the man of God. You'll notice the inscription says that, and in the Hebrew text, that's actually part of the first verse, a prayer of Moses, the man of God. That being the case, this is the oldest of the Psalms. And so the Psalms range in time from the time of Moses to the post-exilic period. But again, this is the oldest of those, and one that is filled with meaning for us yet even today, although approximately 3,500 years have elapsed since the writing of this psalm. Noticing with you in the first place, the first two verses, the emphasis is that God is our dwelling place. God is our home. Let's read together. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. And so what we start out with in this psalm that's going to talk about man and life here being transitory and brief. We start out, before we look at what man is, at looking at who God is. And so his eternality is mentioned. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. And his eternality will be contrasted with the transitoriness of man. But the first part gives such assurance in the first verse. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. It's not just that God provides a dwelling place. God had provided his people with a place to dwell. And in fact, when you look at the book of Numbers, in Numbers chapter 33, there are 42 different places that Israel had camped during their journey in the wilderness wandering period. 42 different sites. But no matter where Moses lived, no matter where Israel lived, God was their home. And to me, that's an important starting place. It's not wrong to enjoy your house, the place where you live. That's a blessing from God. It's a gift from God. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's a real sense in which our house, if we're children of God, should not be our dwelling place, at least not in the primary sense. But it is God. That's not a new concept, by the way. Moses, who also penned the book of Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy chapter 33 at verse 27, Moses said, "The eternal God is your refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms." And so here again, the dwelling place. Jesus, in John chapter 15, used the analogy of the vine and the branches, but he's saying, "Abide in me, and I in you, and you shall bear much fruit." The Lord is our dwelling place. And that's really what gives us security. If you want to talk about security, it's not in our finances. It's not in the house or property we might have. Our security is because of God's eternal, constant presence, and that he is our dwelling place. But in contrast to that, the text is going to speak of the small number of our days here on earth. Not to be morbid, not to be negative or pessimistic, but to be realistic. And the end result is to have a wise heart, a heart of understanding. With that in mind, let's read verses 3 through 12, and keep in mind that the main point here is that life is brief and it passes swiftly. Let's read together. You turn man to destruction and say, "Return, O children of men. For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, and like a watch in the night. You carry them away like a flood. They are like a sleep. In the morning they are like grass which grows up. In the morning it flourishes and grows up. In the evening it is cut down and withered. Verse 7, for we have been consumed by your anger, and by your wrath we are terrified. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your countenance. For all our days have passed away in your wrath. We finish our years like a sigh. Verse 10, the days of our lives are 70 years. And if by reason of strength they are 80 years, yet their boast is only labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away. Who knows the power of your anger? For as the fear of you, so is your wrath. So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. The passage has just talked about who God is. Now it talks about who we are. God is from everlasting to everlasting, and we are made of dust. You may have a translation. For example, the New American Standard in verse 3 renders this, you turn man back to dust and say, return, O children of men. It's worth our while to go back to the beginning. In the book of Genesis, the 2nd chapter. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7, when God first created man. In Genesis 2:7, the text reads, the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being, a nephesh, a living soul. Then, after sin entered the world, and there's the confrontation with Adam, with Eve, and with the serpent. The text says that God said to Adam in Genesis 3 verse 19, in the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. And along that line, turn with me to Ecclesiastes, just a couple of passages in the book of Ecclesiastes as well, to set before us what Psalm 90 is saying as we look at related passages. In Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 20, Ecclesiastes 3:20 reads, all go to one place, all are from the dust, all return to dust. You will remember that in Ecclesiastes, Solomon is especially looking at life under the sun, and how that if you just look at life under the sun, that's vanity. And with regard to death, all go to one place. Whether you're saved or unsaved, whether you're saved or lost, all are from the dust, all return to the dust. And then, in the last chapter of Ecclesiastes, in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, the closing chapter 12, and verse 7 speaks of that point of death. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. And so that's simply saying at the point of death, that spirit is in the hands of a righteous judge. That's true of all. The spirit returns to God who gave it. But what happens to the body? The dust will return to the earth as it was. So back to Psalm 90, all of that, you see, comes to play and help us to understand what this is talking about. I'm reading from the New King James when it says, you turn man to destruction and say, return, O children of men. Return to what? Return to dust. Dust thou art, and to dust you shall return. And so this is simply referring to what has been said from the beginning, and Moses reiterates it right here at this point. So again, with God who is eternal 1,000 years, in your sight are like yesterday when it is past. 1,000 years is nothing to God. But he says it's like a watch in the night. The watch in the night was a 4-hour stretch. It was divided into 3 watches of 4 hours each. That's the watch in the night. So 1,000 years to God, just like a watch in the night. But speaking, though, of humanity and the brevity of life, three figures are used in verse 5. You carry them away like a flood. And so here's the idea. The waters rise up, and all of you, either you've seen in person or you've seen on news clips the destructive force of a flood, but not just the destructive force, but how quickly something is just swept away. It can be a house. It can be a car. It can be a lot of landscape and just be carried away with a flood. And so that's one figure. The life is carried away. Or like a sleep. You know, sometimes it takes me as long as, 2.5 or 3 minutes to drop off to sleep at night. And ordinarily I sleep well. But then you wake up, time to get up and go again. Doesn't take long sometimes to spend the night. And that's like it is, just like you go to sleep, you wake up, and it passes quickly, like a dream. And then the text says, in the morning they're like grass. So like something swept away with a flood, just like the sleeping, just the overnight sleep, or like grass, which grows up. And that metaphor continues then into the 6th verse, where it flourishes, it grows up, and in the evening it cut down and withers. So here it is, but the same day comes up, cut down, is withered, or may be cast into the fire. But the point is, we don't look at grass as being something permanent. And so he says that's what life is like. But then, we've been consumed by your anger, and by your wrath we are terrified. It's not possible to know exactly at what point Moses wrote this song. But scholars have suggested that this may have been during that time, well, starting with Kadesh Barnea, the events there in Numbers chapter 14, where God came down when all those spies, not Joshua and Caleb, but all the rest of them, they said, the land's a good land, but it's not possible for us to possess it because they're giants in the land. We're just like grasshoppers, and the cities have fortified walls, so we can't take it. And all those men of war, they started crying and were fearful, and everybody's ready to go back. And Joshua and Caleb alone tried to reason with the people and plead with them. Don't say that. God is for us. Well, let's go up at once and possess it. These people have nothing. But they listened to the majority report. 603,550 men of war were counted. And only Joshua and Caleb would survive because God came down. And he said, your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness for the next 40 years, 1 year for each day that the spies have spied out the land. We've been consumed by your anger, by your wrath. We are terrified. Someone has suggested that Moses attended more funerals than anybody in history. For the next 40 years, it's a matter of just waiting for that generation to die. God can't use those people. But they're all together. That is to say, they're still a unit as they're traveling and going about in the wilderness. And so they've seen up close the wrath of God. But verse 8 shows why. You have set our iniquities before you, and our secret sins in the light of your countenance. Now it's proper to say that we live in an earth, in a world that is cursed by sin. That we live in a broken world, and sin has impacted the earth. Sin has impacted the environment in which we live. And so sometimes we suffer because we live in a sin-cursed world. Sometimes we suffer because of our own sin. But either way, he's making that point there where he's talking about the cause, that this isn't just something that has happened. Indeed, the Bible teaches that the wages of sin is death. The reason sin entered the world is because man violated God's law. And I know the implications for spiritual death and separation from God, but right now to think in terms of this passage of physical death, again, that's in the world because of sin. And those at Kadesh Barnea were directly responsible for what would cause their death and their failure to enter the promised land. So, we don't know when Moses wrote this, but it could be at that point at Kadesh Barnea when the wrath of God began, or some have suggested at the end of that period, when that 40 years have elapsed, when it's approaching the time that he would ascend Mount Nebo and view the land, though he himself could not see it, but he would view it, and then he died, and the Lord buried him, and no one knows the place of the grave, the text says in Deuteronomy chapter 34. So it could be at the end of life, looking over what he had experienced, and that time having passed, but maybe at some point. But it's certainly plausible that what Moses experienced there, starting with Kadesh Barnea, and for the next 40 years, if that would have had an impact here on his making reference to the wrath of God that was deserved. All our days have passed away in a wrath. We finish our years like a sigh. Well, that's another word picture. You know, you inhale and then you exhale. You know, you breathe in and sometimes you think of, a sigh like that. Well, how long did that take? And he says, we finish our years like a sigh. Now that brings us to verse 10. And that is, the days of our lives are 70 years. And if by reason of strength they are 80 years, yet their boast is only labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off and we fly away. Now, I'm looking at these boys right up here up front. I'm looking at Keegan and Reese and Noah and Titus. And they're listening, but they don't have any idea what I'm talking about. Isaac has no idea what I'm talking about. I don't mean he's not paying attention. I don't mean he's not trying. But when someone the age of you guys and girls tries to understand the passing of 70 or 80 years, and someone telling you that it passes quickly, you can't understand that. Because for you to think of 70 or 80 years and try to grasp that right now, as a very young person, as a teenager, it's like, that's an eternity. That's forever. That's a long time away. And I know that. I felt that way. Bob Waldron felt that way. I still remember that white block house at Summerton. Originally was the meeting house for the Summerton Church of Christ. And they built their building. Bob and Sandra lived in the house. And there was a lot of laughter in that house. Those were good times when I sat at Bob's feet, soaking up the Word and being with him. And as time went on, I was really the first that he studied with in that way to go on to in-depth studies and continual studies. And we began a friendship that was forged through the years, but even at that early time, I was 16 and Bob was 27. He was my older preacher, you see, that I studied with. And I remember him calculating the age. He said, yeah, I can see it all now. I'll be 80 years old, and you'll be 70 years old, and we'll look back, and I'll say, you remember when you were a little whippersnapper and came over and I studied with you? And I remember him throwing that head back and just laughing, in that chair in the living room. That seemed like science fiction to both of us. When he's 80 and I'm 70. This past September, he turned 80. And like Brother Pender seems to enjoy reminding me, I'm real close to the 70 myself. I'm a 52 model. But when Bob said that was yesterday. I remember conducting a gospel meeting up in Tennessee, and Lee and Della Henson were special friends of ours. I conducted funerals for both of them. But I remember seeing Brother Lee Henson, Lee and Della Henson. I remember seeing Lee Henson after an absence of some time, and at that time, age was catching up, and he was on in his 80s, and he said, Brother Leon, My wife and I both gotten old. He said, I don't know how this happened. It's like, I don't know what happened. And here we are. So I know when you hear that now, Lydia, Izzy, when you hear that now, Rebecca, that sounds like science fiction. But this is true. You know how the memories pop up on your phone? In most photo programs, I guess they do that. And there's a photo I took of Linda when we had just married, and we were on our way down to South Georgia, where I was already preaching at that time. And we stopped to have a little picnic on the way, and she's on a table there and opening up a couple of Cokes. We had some stuff prepared for a little picnic. And I remember that day so well. And this summer, that'll be 48 years ago. So let's just go ahead and understand what Moses is saying is true. And by the way, you know, sometimes people show this misleading kind of time scale where, you know, back in 100 years ago, the average lifespan was 40 years, but now it's 70-something. Well, that's misleading. There have always been times in history when, because of lack of nutrition or oppressive work conditions, that the lifespan was very short. But when Moses wrote this, again, a millennium and a half before Christ, 1,500 years, we're rounding it off, before Christ. What was the average lifespan? 70 to 80 years. What's the average lifespan today, 3,500 years later? 70 to 80 years. That's been a constant. Now, you can go before the flood and immediately after the flood if you want to read where people are living for longer than that. But since that time, since the time of Moses, that's been a pretty stable number. So that's just true. Who knows the power of your anger? As the fear of you, so is your wrath. And here again, he's just saying, who understands that fully? But where he's going with that is in verse 12, and this is so important. So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. A heart of wisdom is a wise heart. And so much of the Scripture is talking about that very thing specifically, about how to be wise. You have, for example, the book of Proverbs. The whole book is just on that subject of wisdom. But so many passages teach about that. James talks about the importance of wisdom. And if any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and upbraideth not. Who is wise and understanding among you? Wisdom. We want a heart of wisdom. But notice he says, so teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Well, that's involved in that. Notice, for one thing, the very wording is, so teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. He doesn't say number our years. You know, you might look at it, well, count your years, the years of your life. He says, teach us to number our days. So the concept is that of taking it one day at a time. And that's really what life is made up of. That is, the days. I know the days turn into years, but here on purpose, teach us to number our days. It's like Paul was saying in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 15, to redeem the time, because the days are evil. We're people that the context there says to walk in wisdom. So we redeem the time because the days are evil. See, what's going to happen is you'll reach that 70 or 80, God willing, and not having a premature death. But you'll reach that age and you'll realize there are so many things I wanted to accomplish that are good things, that were good goals, that there won't be time enough to do all the things that I would like to do. Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. See, there are things that we can do now in terms of letting wisdom and God's plan and His purpose be so important to us that we don't waste our time. You know, there's so many things that waste our time. And I don't have time right here to develop that. But there's so many things, some might be neutral things that are not bad, they're just time wasters. Television's a great time waster. Everything's not bad, but I'll tell you, it's getting harder and harder. If you're talking about current programming, it's getting harder and harder to find something you can watch with a clear conscience. Isn't that right? But even if it's something that would not be bad to watch, you still have to determine how much, because you can waste a lot of time with that. Social media can be a great time waster. Have you ever, and this isn't to get on to anybody, I'm just asking, have you ever just, say, gone to check your email? Just going to check your email and find yourself that one thing has led to another, and here 30 minutes has gone by, or an hour has gone by. Or here you had a notification on Facebook and you found yourself just scrolling down, and just a lot of time can be wasted like that. And I'll tell you, your phone, if you even just say, well, I'm going to set aside 15 minutes or 20, 30 minutes just to read and study, and this phone is close by, unless you found a way to turn off all those notifications, it does. And so you look, and there's something about a weather report. You put that down. I'll say, what was I thinking here? And then you try to get your thought again, and another buzz, and someone has sent a text. And then, my phone, before I fixed some of that, when someone would make a Facebook post or an email, it was just making those notification noises all the time. And if you stop to check that all the time, you're going to be wasting a whole lot of time. And then there are bad things we can do to waste our time. Some people, I don't know how this works in your mind, but some people have kind of made a list within their mind of everybody that has offended them. You know, the Bible says love does not keep account of evil. But some people, all the way back to their childhood, they can give you details about who hurt their feelings and who did them wrong, and they just kind of rehearse that all the time, and their thoughts are forever about how people have wronged them and how that they are a victim in this life. That's wasting your time. And anybody that'll listen, sometimes it's just like, you start a tape and it just keeps on playing. Just wasting time, holding on to grudges and bad feelings, hard feelings, negative feelings. We need to be looking for things that will edify, things that will build up, if you want to have a heart of wisdom and number your days. Well, let's conclude the psalm. The way the psalm concludes is really kind of an upbeat note. It's a request for a restoration of divine favor. In fact, there are 5 requests, 5 verses. And each of these verses, the psalmist Moses is asking, he's appealing to God for his grace, appealing for a return to joy. So it's not that this is a depressing psalm, it's a realistic psalm. I often think of the lady that called one time when we were doing our live call-in program, and she said, now where does that say in the Bible that we're only promised 70 years? And I said, I believe I can help you find the passage you're looking for, but it does not say we're promised 70 years. We're not promised tomorrow. It just says that this is the average lifespan, 70 or as much as 80. But with that in mind, I'm saying, now we look at the joy. Look at the 5 requests. Return, O Lord, how long? And have compassion on your servants. Verse 4, O satisfy us early with your mercy, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Verse 15 is the 3rd request. Make us glad according to the days in which you have afflicted us and the years in which we've seen evil. That again would fit with that 40 years of wandering we're talking about. Let your work appear to your servants and your glory to their children. That's the 4th request. And the 5th and final, verse 17, let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us and establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. So In this, start to say David. In this, Moses, our author, again is making request of the Lord, praying for compassion, verse 3. And our word in verse 13, I meant to say. And our word in verse 14 is, satisfy us early with your mercy. Here's that word, Hessid. The loving kindness, unfailing love, God's covenant faithfulness. That's what the psalmist wants. And that's what we should want. That's what we need so desperately. The mercy of God. And the result of which, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days, as verse 14 and even 15 would indicate. But if you want your life of the fleeting 70 or 80 years to mean something, pay attention. Let your work appear to your servants, and your glory to their children. If you want something that'll last after your brief life here, be concerned about the purpose of God. Be concerned about His plan. Do those things that will contribute to edification. Do those things that will contribute to the spiritual needs that are there. When we make God's purpose our purpose in life, then we have something to show for our life, and we've not just been here wasting time and taking up space. Our prayer should be such as David said in Acts, or it says Paul says of David in Acts 13, verse 36. It says that David accomplished the purpose of God in his generation. The book of Ecclesiastes, Samuel and I were talking about this Friday afternoon. I said, what's the main point of the book of Ecclesiastes? And we both agreed that in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, in the closing of that book, when Solomon said, this is the conclusion of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole of man. When we're seeking to that God's purpose, we're not just looking inward, we're looking upward. And so God's purpose is what we're concerned about being worked out in our life and with all those that we can touch. Let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us. Establish the work of our hands. We can pray that when we've made His work ours, when we made His purpose our purpose. We can pray, establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. And we can know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. And it will outlast that brief lifespan here on earth. And let me just say, life is worth the living just because He lives. This morning, if you've not yet obeyed the gospel, life is short. Death is certain. Eternity is long. And we would bid you to obey from the heart the gospel of Christ, to abide in Him, to obey Him, and receive the wonderful blessings He has promised as we stand and sing.